Let's start with opening an image so we actually have something to work with. You do that through File and Open. I've prepared a folder with some images to work with throughout these tutorials. And we'll start with this image called start.tiff. So let's select that one and click Open. Selections is one of the most fundamental functions in Photoshop. And a selection is basically your way of telling Photoshop which part of an image you actually want to work with. If we look at the toolbox here, 3 out of the 6 buttons in the first section here are actually selection tools. And there are even more selection tools hidden beneath these buttons. So there's a lot of different ways to create selections. I think we'll start with looking at the basic shape selection tools, and the tool that is selected, and it's also pre-selected when you start Photoshop for the first time, is this rectangular marquee tool. So with that selected, I'll actually create a selection here so we can see what selections actually do. And to create a selection, you just click and drag diagonally. So now I have a rectangular selection here. If I quickly switch over to the brush tool and start painting in this image, you can see that nothing actually happens until I get inside of the selection that I have. So now I've actually told Photoshop that I only want to be able to change this image within the selected area. I'll just get rid of the brush strokes by going through Edit and Undo Brush tool. And I'll switch back to the rectangular marquee tool again. If you want to deselect, you can actually use some of the selection tools and just click outside of an existing selection. That would get rid of the selection. However, that doesn't work with all the selection tools, and sometimes you can even slip with the selection tool and create a new, very small selection that you might not see. Even though you don't see it, you can only manipulate the image within that selection. So the safest way to actually deselect is to take the long menu way through the menu selection. There you'll find an option called deselect. Or if you want, you can actually learn the keyboard shortcut for deselection, since you'll end up using that command quite a lot. And all the keyboard shortcuts are actually listed at the far right in the menus. So if I choose deselect, the selection disappears, and now I know there's nothing selected in this image. There are a couple of modifier keys connected to these selection tools. And the modifier keys are the keys on the keyboard that actually modify the behavior of the other keys. One of the most common is the Shift key, and the Shift key actually modifies the behavior of the selection tools as well. If I hold down the Shift key when I'm creating a new selection, I'll actually constrain the proportions of that selection. And with the rectangular marquee tool, I'll actually end up with a perfectly square selection. However, if I already have a selection and hold down the Shift key, you can see that the cursor actually changes appearance, and I get this small plus beside the cursor. That actually indicates that if I create a selection at this stage, I'll actually add to the existing selection. So I can actually expand the selection by holding down the Shift key and selecting more of the image. These expanded selections can be connected, but they don't necessarily have to be. So you can, in other words, select different parts of an image. I'll deselect this image again by going through Select and choosing Deselect. The second modifier key is the Alt or Option key. If I hold down the Alt or Option key when I create a new selection, that new selection will actually be created from the center. The default is to create selections from any corner, but with this Alt or Options key, I can actually create selections from the center instead. On the other hand, if I already have a selection and press and hold down the Alt or Options key, the cursor changes appearance again, I get this small minus beside the cursor. The minus actually indicates that I'll subtract from the selection. In order for this to work, I actually need to select a part of an existing selection. When I select a part of a selection, that part that I select will actually disappear. So the Alt or Options key can actually shrink a selection down or subtract from a selection. The Shift key will add to the selection and the Alt or Options key will subtract from the selection. I'll deselect again through Select and Deselect here. The third modifier key is actually the space bar on the keyboard. If I, while I'm still creating a selection, press and hold down the space bar, I can actually move the origin of that selection that I'm creating. And whenever I let go of the space bar, while I still hold the mouse key down, I can continue to resize the selection that I'm currently creating. So the spacebar actually allows me to move the origin around while I still create my selection here. I'll deselect again through Select and Deselect. These modifier keys are actually combinable, so you can combine several of the modifier keys together. In other words, if you hold down both the Alt or Option key and the Shift key, you can create a perfectly square selection from the center. And you can even combine it with the space bar. So if you hold down the Alt and Option key and Shift and space bar, you can move the origin around while you're still creating this perfectly square selection from the center. And when you're working with these modifier keys, you need to hold them down the entire time. So you always let go of the mouse button first, otherwise you lose the constraints. So let the hand rest on the keyboard while you use modifier keys. If you press and hold down on the rectangular marquee tool, you can access the hidden tools underneath that button. And you'll find the elliptical marquee tool there. And that tool works exactly the same as the rectangular marquee tool, with the difference that you get elliptical selections. I'll just deselect here through Select and Deselect. You create an elliptical marquee or an elliptical selection by clicking and dragging diagonally, just like with the rectangular marquee tool. And you can obviously use the modifier keys and combine them the same way as you did with the rectangular marquee tool. So Alt and Shift will create a perfectly circular selection from the center. And again, the spacebar will move the origin around. So the basic functionality is exactly the same here. If you want to move an existing selection, you can actually do that by choosing one of the selection tools and grab that selection somewhere inside the selection and just move it around. And with the selection tool, you'll only move the actual selection. You won't actually move the content within the selection. If you want to move the actual content within the selection, you need to use the Move tool, the first tool in the toolbox. If you grab that tool and grab a hold somewhere within the selection, you'll actually move the content of the selection. I'll undo that and deselect this image. There are other selection tools as well. You can't always get by with elliptical and rectangular selections. This star, for instance, has a more irregular shape that needs some other kind of selection tool. And there are other tools better suited for other kinds of shapes than elliptical and rectangular shapes. And the first of those free-form selection tools is the Lasso tool, which you'll find right below the elliptical and rectangular marquee tool. And the lasso tool works by reining in the portion of the image that you need selected. So you just click and drag around that shape or object that you're trying to select. As you can see, it's not very easy to create a perfect selection here with this lasso tool, especially not with a computer mouse. But I could actually use the modifier keys here to clean up this selection, to get a closer selection. If I hold down the Alt key, Alt or Options key, I can actually select parts of this selection that I want to get rid of and shrink it down to fit the star a little better. And if I need to expand the selection, I can hold down the Shift key to actually add to the selected area. So I can modify this selection and end up with a decent selection if I really work on it. There are more freeform selection tools hidden beneath the lasso tool. If you press and hold down, you can actually access the alternative tools there. I'll start by deselecting before I switch tools here. So I'll go to Select and choose Deselect. And then I'll switch over to the polygonal lasso tool. The polygonal lasso tool works slightly differently than the original lasso tool. Here you actually click to set down attachment points for the selection. Wherever you click, you get an attachment point. And as you can see, it's a lot easier to actually create a very close selection here to the star. You can actually create slightly rounded selections as well by placing these attachment points a little closer to each other. But it's still a polygonal selection, so you have these really straight lines between these attachment points. You can simulate a rounded edge by placing these attachment points really close together. To actually get the selection, or to ready the selection, you need to close this path. And you do that either by clicking on the first attachment point that you set out. And when you point over the first attachment point, you get this little circle beside the cursor, which indicates that this will close the path if you click here. Alternatively, you can actually double click somewhere and it will take the shortest path back to the first attachment point from wherever you are in the image. So as you can see here, the polygonal lasso tool will actually allow you to create a fairly decent selection for this star. The last lasso tool under the lasso tool button here is actually a half automatic selection tool, the magnetic lasso tool. If I start by going to select and deselect, so I'll deselect the image here. The magnetic lasso tool works again slightly differently than the other tools, but you start the same way as you do with the polygonal lasso tool. So you click to create an attachment point, and then you just trace over the edge that you actually want to select. And if the edge contrast is high enough, Photoshop will actually find that edge and place the selection right at the edge. If you need to set out a hard attachment point, if you need to force Photoshop to actually trace the edge where you want, you can just click wherever you want a hard attachment point. Or if you just drag the cursor without clicking, Photoshop will try to trace the edge here as best it can. And you really need fairly high edge contrast to do that successfully. If you make a mistake and start moving around and putting out attachment points where you don't want them, you can actually get rid of them by pressing the backspace key. Sometimes you actually have to trace backwards as well with a mouse cursor to help Photoshop find the attachment points that you need to get rid of. And again, with the magnetic lasso tool, if you point at the first attachment point, you get this circle beside the cursor. If you click there, you'll actually close the selection and end up with a finished selection here. If we look in the options bar, you can find some options for the magnetic lasso tool. And the most interesting here is the contrast option. If you actually lower the contrast, Photoshop will be a lot pickier when it comes to creating this selection. It will require less contrast to actually create a selection. If we deselect and try this, you can see if it works better than with the default setting. It might work slightly better, but you still end up with a really messy selection here. So this is probably not the tool to use for selecting this part. But if you have high enough edge contrast, this tool will actually work fairly well. There are a couple of other automatic or half-automatic selection tools, and you'll find those the next button down from the lasso tool. And we'll start with looking at the hidden one, the Magic Wand tool. So if you press and hold down, you can select the Magic Wand tool. And I need to start by deselecting through Select and Deselect. Even though the name Magic Wand tool suggests that this is a magic tool, it's unfortunately not a magic tool. It's an half-automatic selection tool, which can, depending on the image, actually give you a good starting point, but it's not a magic selection tool. The Magic Wand tool works by clicking somewhere in the image, and it will actually select everything that it finds similar to what you clicked on. And how much similarities it will find, that depends on the tolerance set up in the options bar. A higher value in the tolerance will actually select more of the image. And if you crank it up all the way to 255 levels, you'll actually end up selecting the entire image. Then everything looks similar to the Magic Wand tool. And the reverse happens if you actually lower the tolerance. The lower the tolerance, the pickier the tool will actually become. I'll quickly deselect here so we can use the tool. With a low tolerance, you have to click several times to get the selection that you want. Or rather, you have to use the modifier keys to add to the selection. So if you hold down the Shift key, you can actually add to the selection. And if you click enough, you'll get the entire image selected here as well. So the trick here is to find a tolerance that will actually allow you to select enough of the image, but not too much. So you need to play around with the tolerance setting when you're using the Magic Wand tool. And the other modifier keys works as well. So if you use the Option or Alt key, you can actually deselect parts of the selection, or you can shrink the selection down. So you can subtract with the Magic Wand tool as well. I'll just quickly deselect here. The Magic Wand tool, unfortunately, isn't all that magic, as you've seen already. It requires a fairly plain background where there's not too much going on. If you do have that, it will give you a decent starting point at least. An alternative tool is actually the Quick Selection tool. The Quick Selection tool works by the same basic principle as the Magic Wand tool. It's actually looking for edges, and an edge is where you have enough contrast between two pixels. You with the quick selection tool, you actually don't just click, you actually paint. So you click and drag over those areas that you want to select. The modifier keys actually work the same way here. So if you select more than you wanted to select, you can actually subtract from the selection by holding down the Alt or Options key. And the Shift key will actually add to the selection. The quick selection tool, however, is preset to actually hold down the Shift key, or rather the functionality of holding down the Shift key is already preset in the quick selection tool. So you don't actually have to hold down the Shift key here. Some of you might have noticed that things happen up in the options bar whenever you press down the modifier keys. If you press down the Alt key, for instance, you'll actually get the quick selection tool to subtract from the selection. And if you hold down the Shift key, you won't actually see any difference because Add to Selection is already pre-selected by default with the quick selection tool. If you choose the first option here, New Selection, it will actually replace the existing selection and start an entirely new selection. It will automatically switch over to Add to Selection because that's the preset for this tool. To change the sensitivity of the quick selection tool, you actually work with the diameter of the brush. Up in the options bar, you have a brush size symbol there, where you can actually change the size of the brush that you're using with the quick selection tool. And I'll just increase that size. A larger brush size will actually decrease the sensitivity. You'll make the quick selection tool much more generous. So that's basically the same as increasing the tolerance with the Magic Wand tool. And on the flip side then, if you decrease the diameter of the brush or make a smaller brush, you'll actually make the quick selection tool a little pickier when it selects. That also allows you to actually get into really small areas and select those. So that was a couple of the selection tools that you have available, or rather the manual selection tools that you have available. There are a lot of different ways of creating selections, many more than using the hand tools here. A common trait between all these selection tools is that the basic setting for these selection tools is to create an absolutely sharp selection. If I just create a selection here and move the contents here, you can see that it looks like it's been cut out with a scalpel or a scissor or something. You get a really hard edge. I'll just undo this movement here. If we examine this image, you can see that this image is actually softer at the far edge and harder at the near edge of the star here. In other words, I would need a selection that has a varied hardness. I need a softer edge or selection edge at the far end, and I need a sharper or harder selection edge at the front here. None of the basic tools actually offer this functionality by default. The selections doesn't have to be sharp by default. If you look in the options bar, you have an option there called Feather. It will actually feather the edges of the selection. So if we increase the feather radius here and create a new selection, if we move the content here, you can actually see that the edges have become fairly soft here. I'll just quickly undo that movement again. The problem with actually using feather radius here to create soft selection edges is that you really can't see what you're doing. And if you need to vary the hardness around the selection edge here. You can't really do that by default. You get the same feather radius throughout the entire selection. But there is actually a simple trick to get a varied hardness for a selection. And we'll look at that in the next movie.